Okay, so a three-part series got turned into a four-part series. Big deal. I'm going to start right into this, not waste any time. If you haven't read this yet or haven't heard about this yet, that's why I put this on this three-part series of understanding what the heck is going on in America right now. This episode I call In Action. These theories, these ideas that have built up for the last, say, 50 to 60 years, starting with the post-World War II nihilistic postmodern thought that the Frankfurt School out of Austria that came to America, the postmoderns from France who came to America. This is an open letter, and the University of California, Berkeley, a professor wrote this to his history department, and it went viral. I'm going to read it to you from beginning to end. Like I've said with all of these series, none of these episodes these four-part episodes I put together, none of them will be easy to digest. None of them will be put into a meme. None of them will be put into a soundbite. You have to actually watch all four parts. You have to actually listen and actually read and really take some time to think about what's going on. You can't just toss this out and say, oh, these are all George Soros paid stooges. This is far, far, far bigger than that. There is an absolute groundswell of ideologues who believe what I'm writing to you and what I'm showing you right now. So I want to get into this, not waste any time. I'm going to read this article to you right now. Let me get that. Okay. Dear Professor XYZ, I am one of your colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley. I have met you both personally, but I do not know you closely, and I am contacting you anonymously with apologies. I am contacting you anonymously with apologies. I'm worried that writing this email publicly might lead to me losing my job and likely all future jobs in my field. In your recent department emails, you mentioned our pledge to diversity, but I am increasingly alarmed by the absence of diversity of opinion on the topic of the recent protests and our community's response to them. In the extended links and resources you provided, I could not find a single instance of substantial counter-argument or alternative narrative to explain the underrepresentation of black individuals in academia, or their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. The explanation provided in your documentation to the near exclusion of all others is unvaried. The problems of the black community are caused by whites, or when whites are not physically present by the infiltration of white supremacy and white systemic racism into American brains, souls, and institutions. Many cognate objections to this thesis have been raised by sober voices, including from within the black community itself, such as Thomas Sowell, Wilford Riley. These people are not racist or Uncle Toms. They are intelligent scholars who reject a narrative that strips black people of agency and systematically externalizes the problems of the black community onto outsiders. Their view is entirely absent from the department and university-wide communiques. The claim that the difficulties that the black community faces are entirely casually explained by exogenous factors in the form of white systemic racism, white supremacy, and other forms of white discrimination remains a problematic hypothesis that should be vigorously challenged by historians. Instead, it is being treated as an axiomatic and actionable truth without serious consideration of its profound flaws or its worrying implications of total black impotence. This hypothesis is transforming our institutions and our culture without any space for dissent outside of a tightly policed, narrow discourse. A counter-narrative exists. If you have time, please consider examining some of the documents I attach at the end of this email. Overwhelmingly, the reasoning provided by Black Lives Matter and allies is either primarily anecdotal, as in the case with the bulk of Tanisha Coates' undeniably moving article, or it's transparently motivated. As an example of the latter problem, consider the proportion of black incarcerated Americans. This proportion is often used to characterize the criminal justice system as anti-black. However, if we use the precise same methodology, we would have to conclude that the criminal justice system is even more anti-male than it is anti-black. Would we characterize criminal justice as a systemically misandrous conspiracy against innocent American men? I hope you see that this type of reasoning is flawed and requires a significant suspension of our rational faculties. Black people are not incarcerated at higher rates than their involvement in violent crime would predict. This fact has been demonstrated multiple times across multiple jurisdictions in multiple countries. And yet, I see my department uncritically reproducing a narrative that diminishes black agency in favor of a white-centric explanation. That appeals to the department's apparent desire to shoulder the white man's burden and to promote a narrative of white guilt. If we claim that the criminal justice system is white supremacist, why is it that Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and Nigerian Americans are incarcerated at vastly lower rates than white Americans? This is a funny sort of white supremacy. Even Jewish Americans are incarcerated less than Gentile whites. I think it's fair to say that your average white supremacist disapproves of Jews, and yet these alleged white supremacists are incarcerated Gentiles at vastly higher rates than Jews. None of this is addressed in your literature. None of this is explained beyond hand-waving and ad hominems. Those are racist dog whistles. The model minority myth is white supremacist. Only fascists talk about black-on-black crime ad nauseum. These types of statements do not amount to counter-arguments. They are simply arbitrary offensive classifications intended to silence and oppress discourse. Any serious historian will recognize these for the silencing orthodoxy tactics they are. Common to suppressive regimes, doctrines, and religions throughout time and space, they are intended to crush real diversity and permanently exile the culture of robust criticisms from our department. True that. Increasingly, we are being called upon to comply and subscribe to Black Lives Matter problematic view of history, and the department is being presented as unified on the matter. In particularly, ethnic minorities are being aggressively marshaled into a single position. Any apparent unity is surely a function of the fact that dissent could almost certainly lead to expulsion or cancellation for those of us in a precarious position, which is no small number. I personally don't dare speak out against Black Lives Matter narrative, and with this barrage of alleged unity being mass-produced by the administration, tenured professors, the UC administration, corporate America, and the media, the punishment for dissent is a clear danger at a time of widespread economic vulnerability. I am certain that if my name were attached to this email, I would lose my job and all future jobs, even though I believe in and can justify every word I type. The vast majority of violence visited on the black community is committed by black people. There are virtually no marches for these invisible victims, no public silences, no heartfelt letters from the UC regents, deans, and department heads. The message is clear. Black lives only matter when whites take them. Black violence is expected and insoluble, while white violence requires explanation and demands solution. Please look into your hearts and see how monstrously bigoted and this formulation truly is. No discussion is permitted for non-black victims of black violence who proportionately outnumber black victims of non-black violence. This is especially bitter in the Bay Area, where Asian victimization by black assailants has reached epidemic proportions to the point that the San Francisco police chief has advised Asians to stop hanging good luck charms on their doors, as this attracts the attention of overwhelmingly black home invaders like George Floyd. For this actual lived, physically experienced reality of violence in the USA, there are no marches, no tearful emails from department heads, no support from McDonald's and the Walmart. For the history department, our silence is not a mere abrogation of our duty to shed light on the truth, it is a rejection of it. The claim that black interracial violence is the product of redlining, slavery, and other injustices is largely a historical claim. It is for historians, therefore, to explain why Japanese internment or the massacre of European Jews hasn't led to an equivalent rates of dysfunction and low performance among Japanese and Jewish Americans, respectively. Arab Americans have been viciously demonized since 9/11, as have Chinese Americans more recently. However, both groups outperform white Americans on nearly all testing indices, as do Nigerian Americans, who, incidentally, have black skin. It is for historians to point out and discuss these anomalies. However, no real discussion is possible in the current climate at our department. The explanation is provided to us. Disagreement with it is racist, and the job of historians is to further explore additional ways in which the explanation is additionally correct. This is a mockery of the historical profession. Most troubling, our department appears to have been entirely captured by the interests of the Democratic National Convention and the Democratic Party more broadly. To explain what I mean, consider what happens if you choose to donate to Black Lives Matter, an organization UCB History has explicitly promoted in its recent mailers. All donations to the official BLM website are immediately redirected to Act Blue Charities, an organization primarily concerned with bankrolling election campaigns for Democrat candidates. Donating to BLM today is indirectly donating to Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. This is grotesque given the fact that American cities with the worst rates of black on black violence and police on black violence are overwhelmingly Democrat run. Minneapolis itself has been entirely in the hands of Democrats for over 5 decades. The systemic racism there was built by successive Democrat administrations. The patronizing and condescending attitudes of Democrat leaders towards the black community, exemplified by nearly every Biden statement on the black race, all but guarantee a perpetual state of misery, resentment, poverty, and the attendant grievance politics, which are simultaneously annihilating American political discourse and black lives. And yet, donating to Black Lives Matter is bankrolling the election campaigns of men like Mayor Fry, who saw their cities devolve into violence. This is a grotesque capture of a good faith movement for necessary police reform and our department by a political party. Even worse, there are virtually no avenues for dissent in academic circles. I refuse to serve the party, and so should you. The total alliance of major corporations involved in human exploitation with BLM should be a warning flag to us, and yet this damning evidence goes unnoticed, purposefully ignored, or perversely celebrated. We are the useful idiots of the wealthiest classes, carrying water for Jeff Bezos and other actual real modern-day slavers. Starbucks, an organization using literal black slaves and its coffee plantation suppliers, is in favor of Black Lives Matter. Sony, an organization using cobalt mined by yet more literal black slaves, many of whom are children, is in favor of BLM. And so apparently are we. The absence of counter-narrative enables this obstinity. Fiat lux, indeed. There are also large constituencies of what can only be called race hustlers. Hucksters of all colors who benefit from stoking the fires of racial conflict to secure administrative jobs, charity management positions, academic jobs and advancement, or personal political entrepreneurship. Given the direction our history department appears to be taking, far from any commitment to truth, we can regard ourselves as formative training institutions for this brand of snake oil salesmen. Their activities are corrosive, demolishing any hope at harmonious racial coexistence in our nation and colonizing our political and institutional life. Many of their voices are unironically segregationists. MLK would likely be called an Uncle Tom if he spoke on our campus today. We are training leaders who intend explicitly to destroy one of the only truly successful ethnically diverse societies in modern history. As the PRC, an ethno-nationalist and aggressively racial chauvinist national polity with null immigration, and they're talking about the People's Republic of China, so you know, and no concept of jus solis, increasingly present itself as a global political alternative to the U.S. I ask you, is this wise? Are we really doing the right thing? As a final point, our university and department has made multiple statements celebrating and eulogizing George Floyd. Floyd was a multiple felon who once held a pregnant black woman at gunpoint. He broke into her home with a gang of men and pointed a gun at her pregnant stomach. He terrorized the women in his community. He sired and abandoned multiple children, playing no part in their support or upbringing, failing one of the most basic tests of decency for a human being. He was a drug addict and sometimes drug dealer, a swindler who preyed upon his honest and hardworking neighbors. And yet the regents of the University of California and the historians of university's history department are celebrating this violent criminal, elevating his name to virtual sainthood. A man who hurt women, a man who hurt black women with the full collaboration of the university's history department, corporate America, most mainstream media outlets, and some of the wealthiest and most privileged opinion-shaping elites of the USA. He has become a cultural hero, buried in a golden casket, his recognized family showered with gifts and praise. Americans are being socially pressured into kneeling for this violent, abusive misogynist. A generation of black men are being coerced into identifying with George Floyd, the absolute worst specimen of our race and species. I'm ashamed of my department. I would say that I'm ashamed of both of you, but perhaps you agree with me and are simply afraid, as I am, of the backlash of speaking the truth. It's hard to know what kneeling means when you have to kneel to keep your job. It shouldn't affect the strength of my argument above, but for the record, I write as a person of color. My family has been personally victimized by men like Floyd. We are aware of the condescending depredations of the Democrat Party against our race, the humiliating assumption that we are too stupid to do STEM, that we need special help lowering in requirements to get ahead in life, is richly familiar to us. I sometimes wonder if it wouldn't be easier to deal with open fascists who are at least then would be straightforward in calling me a subhuman and who are unlikely to share my race. The ever-present soft bigotry of low expectations and the permanent claim that the solution to the plight of my people rests exclusively on the goodwill of whites rather than on our own hard work is psychologically devastating. No other group in America is systematically demoralized in this way by its alleged allies. A whole generation of black children are being taught that not only by begging and weeping and screaming will they get handouts from guilt-ridden whites. No message will more surely devastate their futures, especially if whites run out of guilt, or if indeed Americans run out of whites. If this had been done to Japanese Americans or Jewish Americans or Chinese Americans, then Chinatown and Japantown would surely be no different to the roughest parts of Baltimore and East St. Louis today. The history department of UCB is now an integral institution promulgator of a destructive and degenerating fallacy about the black race. I hope you appreciate the frustration behind this message. I do not support Black Lives Matter. I do not support the Democrat grievance agenda and the party's uncontested capture of our department. I do not support the party co-opting my race, as Biden recently did in his disturbing interview, claiming that voting Democrat and being black are isomorphic. I condemn the manner of George Floyd's death and join you in calling for greater police accountability and police reform. However, I will not pretend that George Floyd was anything other than a violent misogynist, a brutal man who met a predictably brutal end. I also want to protect the practice of history. Cleo is no groveling handmaid to politicians and corporations. Like us, she is free. Pretty powerful stuff. Does that guy or woman, whoever wrote this, not perfectly capture the mindset of what's going on in America right now? I especially like this part where he says, the ever-present soft bigotry of low expectations and the permanent claim that the solutions to the plight of my people rests exclusively on the goodwill of whites rather than on our own hard work is psychologically devastating. No other group in America is systematically demoralized in this way by its alleged allies. This is exactly what Malcolm X was warning black people about in the 60s when he said that the black man's biggest enemy is the white liberal. I want to build on this narrative here, this idea here, with one more video. Again, I told you these videos weren't going to be quick and easy. They weren't going to be easy to digest. You might even have to re-listen to them or re-watch them. I want to show you one more thing, and that is this right here. Joe Rogan had Jordan Peterson on his show back in 2016 of December, and they talk about class-based guilt. I want to play this for you, and this ties in very well to the mindset of what's going on right now and that paper that professor wrote. This is 10 minutes long, and we'll wrap this up. Don't turn off. Keep watching.
You should step back. And this is a narrative that gets repeated over and over again in the social justice warrior culture, this idea that you should just step back and let these others talk because they understand more.
And the others are always other group members.
Yes, right.
And somehow their discourse is to be privileged in reverse because hypothetically they're a member of an oppressed class.
Right.
Of course, and you can multiply the numbers of oppressed classes ad nauseum, which is another part of the problem.
Yeah, like the idea is that in giving them privilege because they have been marginalized, you will balance things out. You will somehow or another reverse the scale.
And that's another example of the class-based guilt idea. You know, it doesn't seem to me self-evident that I'm to blame for slavery, for example. I mean, being a Canadian, it's a slightly different situation, I suppose. But the idea that as a member of a culture, that you're somehow responsible for the past sins of that culture, let's say, it's a very, very anti-Western ethos. It goes along with this idea of class guilt, because your group membership is the most important thing. If your group at some point in the past did something reprehensible, which of course every group has done, that's for sure, then you are de facto responsible in the present for that.
How do you think we got to this point where people are repeating these patterns that were ultimately incredibly unsuccessful and dangerous and deadly in the past, like Marxism, for example? Like, people proudly proclaim themselves as having Marxist ideology.
One in five social scientists claims to be a Marxist.
How do they not understand the history? Well, why don't you fill people in on how that went bad?
Well, the estimates vary, but in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people were killed in internal oppression alone. So that's pretty bad. And then in China, which was operating under exactly the same principles, it might have been up to 100 million killed during Mao's time. And of course, Mao is still revered in China, appallingly enough. And Vietnam and Cambodia, and wherever these ideas were implemented, Cuba, wherever these ideas were implemented, the result was absolute mayhem. And I think what happened is that the Marxist ideas are actually quite attractive if you're an intellectual, and if you're tilted towards compassion from a personality perspective, because they're based on doctrines like from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And the idea that you should fulfill people's needs, or that society should fulfill people's needs, is on the surface of it an attractive idea. Of course, the problem is who gets to define the needs and who gets to define the abilities, and that really is a big problem. And then those ideas were put into practice first in the Soviet Union, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, did a very lovely job of detailing in horrifying detail how those initial doctrines were transformed into legislation, and then how those legislation was transformed into endless genocide, essentially, and almost destroyed the world. Let's not forget that. Partly with the help of Castro, who just died. The doctrines, when put into into actual practice, were murderous instantaneously. Now, what happened? There were always apologists for the left in the West, especially in France, especially among the French intellectuals, especially in the late 1960s. And then when all of the information about what was happening in the Soviet Union came flooding forward, and that culminated, say, about 1973, when Solzhenitsyn's book was published, the French intellectuals changed their tune. Instead of agitating on the part of the working class, which allied them with murderous Marxists, they switched and started to talk about power and to talk about group identity. It was like a sleight of hand. The underlying pathological philosophy remained exactly the same, but the surface nomenclature changed, and that became very attractive. And at the same time, the Soviet Union dissolved. And so one of the problems I think we have now, a perverse problem, is that these Marxist ideas are very attractive to compassionate intellectuals, and we don't have good, bad examples like the Soviet Union around that everybody can point to and go, yeah, well, that sounds good, but, what about the murderous death camps and the millions of people who are suffering? We still have North Korea, but, people treat North Korea like it's a joke instead of like it's an exemplar of a pathological system. And people have no historical memory, like my students. And that's partly because they're taught so badly in schools, is they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. They have absolutely no idea. They know a little bit about the Second World War, maybe. And, of course, people generally know about the Holocaust, but they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. So they have no idea where these ideas could lead. And the universities and the high schools are so full of people who are radically left-leaning that the students are never taught any proper history. They're taught about the evils of capitalism. And, it's not like any system is perfect, but there's a difference between imperfect and consciously murderous.
I think one of the things that you just said that's very important is that it's attractive to compassionate intellectuals, people that, without really looking at what the potential for these laws and regulations, what the negative potential for them is, the underlying inclination to lean towards that is that you care about people and that you want people to be okay. And
you're kind of treating them like they're your children.
Yes.
And I don't mean that in an entirely sarcastic manner. It's reasonable in some sense to treat other people like people that you love, although it's not reasonable in very many other ways, which is why you don't invite every stranger on the street to come and live with you in your house. I mean, everybody puts up boundaries, and you have to do that. But and people tend more than we ever expected, and I've done a lot of research in this in my lab, that people do tend to vote and think their temperament a lot more than anyone really realizes. And if you're kind and that's your highest virtue, then you tend to treat people like they're kin, because that's what kind means, right? It's an extension of the word kin. But that doesn't work well in larger groups. You need other principles. And so you look at something like the idea of equity, which is equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. On the surface of it, it seems perfectly reasonable to say, well, if every resource isn't distributed absolutely equally to every group, then the system is unfair. And on the face of it, that's a reasonable proposition, but it falls apart under minimal examination. So here's something to think about for everyone who thinks that equality of an outcome is a good idea. It's like, why the hell are you striving for anything then? Because the reason anyone strives to better themselves or to develop a skill or to move forward in life at all is to produce inequality. You're trying to rise above the mediocre masses every time you make an effort at anything. And so everything that we associate positive movement forward to, or positive motivation, is actually an attempt to render the world more unequal. Now, you're rendering it unequal in a just way, right? Because we might say, well, if you work really hard, you deserve an unequal outcome. Well, yeah, unless you want people to stop working hard. And that was the old joke in the Soviet Union, you know. They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. So it's so thoughtless. That's the problem. Well, and it's also extremely annoying for people who've worked really hard and who've made the requisite sacrifices to become successful along some dimension, to have that immediately attributed to their oppression.
Yes.
And it's not obvious that that's something we want to do. It's like, for the social justice warrior types out there who might be listening, it's like, are you really willing to say that every single person who's accomplished something has done that as a consequence of oppression? That's again what the Soviets claimed with regards to the successful peasants just before the 1920s. It's like, well, the peasants weren't emancipated. They were serfs until about 30 years before that. They were serfs. They were basically slaves. And some of them had clambered up to the point where maybe they owned their hut and a cow and could, employ someone. Well, the Soviet claim was, well, that's all theft. You got that all because you're an oppressor. And so then the Soviet intellectuals went into the villages. And just imagine how this happened. So imagine a village, a small town where everyone knows everybody. And there's maybe 10, 20 people there who are moderately successful. Okay, and so you can imagine that those 20 people have like 100 enemies at the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution. Useless, horrible people who are jealous and resentful about the fact that these people have been successful. Okay, so now the intellectuals come in and say, property is theft, success is oppression. And then they look for the people in the village who are willing to move against those 20 successful people. Well, those guys at the bottom, those 100 resentful, jealous, murderous people at the bottom, they're just waiting for an opportunity to go kick down some doors. And that's exactly what they did in the 1920s. And as I said, they wiped out all their productive peasants. And then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. They had posters. The Soviets produced posters in the 1930s that said, essentially, don't forget, it's wrong to eat your children. So,
whoa.
Yeah, whoa.
So I'm going to pause it right there. This is that part that Joe Rogan goes back to. He says that intellectual, what did he say? The compassionate intellectual, the wannabe intellectual, compassionate person. It's okay to be compassionate. It's okay to be intellectual, but you need to know your history. You need to know what's going on. If Jordan Peterson laid it out perfectly right there. What's happening right now is identical to what happened in the early 1900s Bolshevik Revolution right after World War I. These radical revolutionary leftists were convincing everyone, the haves versus the have-nots, that the haves got it through being power hungry and stealing it from everyone. And that article I just read you, that's exactly what we're being told today. Is that black people in America are being oppressed by white supremacy, but we can't find the white supremacists. Structural racism, but we can't name the structures. Institutional discrimination, but nobody's naming the institutions. These are big, grand phrases that sound legitimate and sound spooky, and everybody is using them. But like he asks there, is that really the game you want to play? Do you really believe that every single person who has made even this much of a bit of a wealth for themselves has done it with this deep-seated, power-hungry, awful mindset that is destroying everyone else and gimme, gimme, gimme? I don't believe that. And I think that what the left right now is playing, the Democrat Party, if you want to, the left, whatever you want to describe, the progressives, is a very, very dangerous game where truth is all relevant. Like the article I read, that university professor laid it out so well. You guys are laying out all these facts and all these arguments, and you're searching for more arguments to back up what you're putting out. But the truth over here, you're missing the elephant in the room of why there's so much crime and why there's so much destruction. And if that's true, then why aren't these other identities, other groups suffering as well? I think that Jordan Peterson makes a very good point there, and I'm going to end this episode when he says that the game that's being played is like a firing circle. We're all just going to shoot each other. We play this progressive game, this progressive ideology to the end of its logical conclusion. We're all going to be suffering. Nobody wins. And a few very, very iron-fisted, power-hungry people are going to assume power not through a democratic republic, but through tyranny and some form of a coup, and then immediately murder all dissenters and anyone who can get in the way. This isn't conspiracy. This is just knowing what's happened in the last 120 or so years of human history. So again, for those of you at home who are still sitting there and like, I cannot understand, how do we get to this point? I hope this episode has brought you a little more clarity. Share this with your friends, your family, your neighbors, your coworkers who are still a little bit like confused, like what? Or even sympathetic to these causes. And I will see you on the last and final episode. Thanks.